amongst the other complexities of Oak Island, it's not oriented any particular way, so I'm never quite sure where north and south.
Money pit if you've never found any money.
Because the money, figuratively, has been going into the money.
Oh, I understand.
For more than 200 years, Oak Island has buried its secrets deeper than anyone could reach. 6 people are known to have lost their lives searching for what lies beneath it, and one family alone has reportedly spent more than $30 million trying to solve the mystery. Season after season, the island has defeated engineers, divers, treasure hunters, geologists, and wealthy investors who believed they had finally found the answer. But now, something has changed. During the latest investigation, Marty Lagina stood over a borehole camera feed and suddenly went silent. What the team saw below the island wasn't just another strange object or another unexplained anomaly. It appeared to connect pieces of evidence that had been sitting in front of them for years. And if their interpretation is correct, the mystery of Oak Island may have just entered an entirely different chapter. The number being discussed is staggering: $318 million. So what exactly did they find beneath the island, and why has it caused researchers to take another serious look at a mystery that has survived for more than 2 centuries? Before we go any deeper, make sure you hit like and subscribe, because we're about to uncover the evidence, the discoveries, and the shocking connection that could finally explain what Oak Island has been hiding all these years. Let's get into it. To understand why this season of Oak Island could be different, you first have to understand what this place has demanded from everyone who dared to search beneath it. The story reaches back to 1795, when 3 teenagers exploring a small island off Nova Scotia's south shore noticed something unusual beneath an old oak tree. There was a depression in the ground, and naturally, they wanted to know what caused it. So they started digging. What they encountered almost immediately was something that should never have been there by accident. Beneath the soil was a shaft containing wooden platforms, reportedly placed at intervals of roughly 10 feet. It looked less like a natural formation and more like a deliberately constructed underground structure. That discovery became the foundation of what would eventually be called the Money Pit, and the name could hardly have been more appropriate. For nearly 2 centuries, Oak Island has consumed enormous amounts of money, equipment, time, and human effort. Nearly every major attempt to penetrate the depths has encountered the same enemy: water. Engineers have long suspected that the original shaft may be connected to an elaborate system of artificial flood tunnels leading toward the surrounding ocean. According to this theory, the system was designed so that when excavators approached the hidden chamber, seawater would pour into the workings and destroy the excavation. And that is exactly what happened again and again. Pumps failed, shafts collapsed, heavy machinery became trapped in the mud. In some cases, equipment was simply abandoned underground because recovering it would have cost more than leaving it behind. Then came one of the darkest chapters in the island's history. During a 1960s excavation attempt, an explosion and subsequent collapse reportedly claimed the lives of several men. The tragedy added another layer to Oak Island's reputation. It wasn't merely a difficult place to excavate. To many people, it had become a cursed one. That was the environment Marty and Rick Lagina entered when they became major stakeholders in the island in the early 2000s. Both were businessmen and engineers from Michigan. They understood numbers, machinery, construction, and engineering far better than they understood legends. Yet somehow, the centuries-old mystery pulled them in. Their investigation eventually became the History Channel series, The Curse of Oak Island, which reached its 12th season. Over the years, viewers have watched the team throw almost every modern technique available at the mystery. They have drilled hundreds of feet underground, constructed dams, sent divers into dangerous shafts, used metal detectors and geophysical surveys, and sent mysterious fragments to laboratories for analysis. and none of it has been cheap. Estimates have placed the Lagina family's investment in the search at many millions of dollars. Some figures circulated by longtime followers have even suggested that Marty's personal financial commitment could exceed $80 million when equipment, permits, engineering specialists, consultants, transportation, and the enormous logistical demands of operating on a swamp-covered island are taken into account. That is the scale of the gamble, a legend more than 2 centuries old. Millions of dollars spent trying to determine whether that legend is based on something real. And despite everything the team had uncovered, there was still no definitive answer. Until the evidence began pointing somewhere very specific. The clue. Everyone may have missed. This is what makes the latest investigation so interesting. The potential breakthrough didn't necessarily begin with another massive excavation. Instead, the team went back through information they had already collected over years of research and started looking at it from a different perspective. During the show's investigations, researchers have relied on ground-penetrating radar, seismic equipment, borehole cameras, drilling data, and other technologies to map what lies beneath the island. Much of what they found could easily be explained by the island's natural geology. Rock, clay, groundwater, and occasional cavities created naturally over long periods of erosion. Nothing particularly extraordinary. The kind of information that can easily disappear into a research file and never become important again. Except there was one anomaly that kept returning. Different surveys, different years, different equipment, and yet roughly the same underground location continued to produce an unusual reading. The anomaly appeared to represent a cavity approximately 10 feet across, positioned deeper than many of the excavations that had come before it. For years, there was an obvious explanation. Maybe it was simply a natural void. Limestone bedrock can develop underground cavities when groundwater gradually dissolves the rock over enormous periods of time. On an island like Oak Island, that possibility couldn't simply be ignored. Then the researchers noticed something that changed the equation. The data matched the history. The team compared newer scans with older borehole records. Then they went even further, matching those findings against excavation reports written by treasure hunters during the 19th century. And that comparison produced an astonishing result. The underground anomaly appeared to correspond remarkably closely with historical descriptions of a cement vault and timber cribbing structures reportedly encountered by earlier excavators. Think about what that means. People working on Oak Island long before modern radar, seismic scanners, or underground cameras existed had already documented structures in approximately the same location. They couldn't see the modern scans. They couldn't know what today's instruments would eventually detect. Yet their old descriptions appeared to overlap with the location of the modern anomaly. That changed the nature of the investigation. Suddenly, this wasn't simply a question of unusual geology. It became a question of engineering. If those historical accounts and modern scans were describing the same underground feature, then there was a possibility that someone had deliberately constructed something beneath the island centuries ago. The problem was that identifying a possible structure and actually reaching it were two completely different challenges. Oak Island had already demonstrated what happens when you attack its underground systems too aggressively. So the team needed a way to investigate the anomaly without triggering the flooding mechanisms that had defeated previous generations of treasure hunters. And then another piece of evidence entered the picture. Metal detection surveys conducted around the same depth reportedly produced readings consistent with worked metal. This wasn't the broad, scattered signal you might expect from random pieces of farm equipment, construction debris, or material left behind by passing ships. The signal appeared more concentrated, more defined, something that could potentially represent a specific object rather than countless fragments spread throughout the ground. Then there were the wood samples. Fragments recovered from nearby boreholes were reportedly subjected to laboratory analysis, with dating results placing the material within a time frame compatible with some of Oak Island's oldest theories, potentially centuries before the Laginas arrived, and even before the famous 1795 discovery. Suddenly, several independent lines of evidence were pointing toward the same underground location. Modern scans, historical excavation records, metal detection readings, laboratory analysis. For the first time, the investigation appeared to be moving beyond a simple story based on legends and speculation. There was physical evidence that seemed to be converging on a particular point beneath the island. But there was still one enormous obstacle. How do you reach something buried deep beneath Oak Island without destroying the very evidence you're trying to find? Knowing that something may exist underground is one challenge. Getting to it is another. And this season made that distinction painfully obvious. The team had already spent years dealing with collapsing shafts, unstable ground, flooding, and heavy machinery disappearing into the unforgiving terrain. Every attempt to go deeper carried the same risk. One wrong move could destroy the structure they had spent years trying to locate. And this time, they couldn't afford to make that mistake. The island wasn't getting any easier. The ground was still unstable. The clay could shift without warning, and the suspected flood tunnels seemed to become a problem the moment excavation got too close to the center of the swamp. Previous seasons had already shown what that could mean. Drilling equipment was abandoned. Expensive machinery was written off. Entire operations were suspended for weeks or even months, while engineers returned to their plans and tried to figure out what had gone wrong. Oak Island doesn't simply resist people who underestimate it. It seems to punish anyone who tries to force the answer too quickly. So this time, the team took a completely different approach. Rather than sinking one enormous shaft directly toward the target, the same basic strategy that had frustrated excavators for generations, they began drilling a network of smaller boreholes. Cameras and sensors could then be lowered through those narrow openings from different directions. The goal wasn't to immediately tear open the ground. It was to understand what was underneath it first. By approaching the suspected target from multiple angles, researchers could gradually construct a three-dimensional picture of the underground area before deciding whether a larger excavation was even necessary. It was slower. It was more methodical. But, most importantly, it dramatically reduced the chances of destroying the very structure they were trying to investigate. And eventually, that patience produced something the team had been searching for. The borehole footage suggested that the anomaly wasn't simply an empty pocket beneath the ground. It appeared to have boundaries, and those boundaries seemed unusually regular. The shape was difficult to explain as the product of random erosion or a naturally formed cavity. Then the camera revealed something even more intriguing. Within part of the void, footage reportedly showed what appeared to be fragments of worked metal along the interior of the cavity. Their position and orientation seemed unusual enough to raise the possibility that they were connected to a deliberate structure rather than simply debris that had fallen into a natural opening. A specialist brought in to examine the footage reportedly noted that the geometry appeared more consistent with a constructed chamber than an ordinary geological cavity. And that distinction is enormous. A natural void forms because of geological processes. A constructed chamber requires people. It means someone would have had to create the space, shape, or reinforce its interior, and potentially seal or protect it, long before modern excavators ever arrived on the island. Now combine that possibility with the earlier metal detection readings. For the first time, the investigation appeared to have several different forms of evidence pointing toward the same underground location. Not another centuries-old story. Not another mysterious document. Not simply a legend repeated by generations of treasure hunters. This time, there were sensor readings, borehole imagery, and laboratory-tested materials that appeared to be converging on one specific area beneath the Oak Island swamp, and for a series that has spent years being criticized for promising dramatic discoveries only to reveal another small piece of the puzzle. This could represent something genuinely different. But if there really is a man-made chamber down there, one question becomes impossible to avoid. So, what is actually inside? Oak Island has never suffered from a lack of theories. If anything, the opposite is true. There have always been so many possible explanations that separating historical evidence from speculation has been one of the biggest challenges of the entire mystery. One of the most famous theories connects Oak Island to the Knights Templar. According to this idea, the island may have been used to conceal religious artifacts, valuable documents, or other objects transported from Europe centuries ago and hidden far from the reach of rival powers. Another possibility comes from Britain's military and colonial history. Perhaps the underground structure was created to hide a military payroll, valuable supplies, or captured goods during one of the many conflicts that took place along the Atlantic coast. Then, there is the enduring story involving Marie Antoinette. The theory claims that valuable jewels belonging to the French queen may have been smuggled out of France during the Revolution and transported across the Atlantic, where they were supposedly hidden for safekeeping. But there is another explanation that is considerably less dramatic. Maybe Oak Island isn't hiding a legendary treasure at all. Perhaps what lies underground is evidence of early colonial engineering, a storage facility, defensive installation, or other practical structure constructed by settlers or military engineers for reasons that had nothing to do with buried riches. At this point, none of these theories has been conclusively proven, and that's important, because the existence of a suspicious underground structure doesn't automatically tell us who built it, when it was constructed, or what it was designed to protect. What makes the latest evidence particularly interesting is the location. The newly investigated void appears to correspond with historical descriptions recorded during different periods of Oak Island's long excavation history. If those correlations continue to hold up, it would suggest that whoever created the underground structure wasn't simply hiding something beneath a few feet of soil. They were attempting to protect it. Depth alone may not have been enough. The suspected platforms, possible flood tunnels, carefully positioned underground structures, and the apparent complexity of the system all raise the possibility that the site was intentionally designed to make unauthorized access extremely difficult. In other words, the island may not have simply contained something valuable. It may have been engineered to keep people away from it. And then there's the $318 million question. Now we need to talk about the number you've probably been waiting for, $318 million. That figure should be treated very carefully. It isn't a confirmed valuation of treasure sitting beneath Oak Island. Instead, it comes from informal estimates within the wider Oak Island community, combining the island's historical significance with speculative calculations about what valuable artifacts, precious metals, documents, or relics might theoretically be worth if they were actually discovered. Those estimates sometimes draw comparisons with other major historical treasure discoveries and attempt to calculate potential value based on the size and nature of the suspected underground chamber. But until something is physically recovered, independently authenticated, and publicly verified, $318 million remains exactly what it should be treated as: a possibility, not a fact. And that distinction matters, because after more than 2 centuries of rumors, failed excavations, competing theories, and extraordinary claims, Oak Island has taught investigators one lesson repeatedly. A theory isn't proof. A promising signal isn't proof. And even an underground chamber isn't necessarily proof of treasure. But what we can say with much greater confidence is that after 12 seasons of false starts, partial discoveries, and tantalizing clues, the investigation may now be closer than ever to finding physical evidence that genuinely corresponds with the legend that has drawn treasure hunters to Oak Island for more than 200 years. And if that connection survives independent testing, the next question won't be whether something unusual is beneath Oak Island. It will be much more difficult. Who put it there? And what were they trying so desperately to protect? For more than 2 centuries, people have tried to reach the secrets buried beneath Oak Island. But what happens if the team has finally located the structure? That's where the real difficulty begins. Because discovering something underground and actually recovering it are 2 completely different challenges, and Oak Island has spent 200 years proving that distinction the hard way. The suspected flood tunnels remain the biggest obstacle. They have defeated heavily financed excavation attempts in the past, including major commercial operations during the 20th century that ultimately left the island with little more than enormous expenses and unanswered questions. So reaching this newly identified chamber won't be as simple as digging a bigger hole. If the team decides to excavate it directly, engineers may first have to control groundwater entering the system from several locations. The existing shafts could also require additional reinforcement to prevent collapses. And if historical reports and current borehole information are correct, there may be another complication. Part of the chamber could be underwater. That could transform the next stage of the investigation into a highly specialized recovery operation, potentially requiring divers and underwater excavation experts capable of working in extremely confined and unstable underground conditions. But there's another issue that may be even more important. Verification. This is where Oak Island claims need to be treated carefully. Radar can identify unusual underground formations. Sensors can detect anomalies. Borehole cameras can reveal shapes and surfaces. But none of those technologies can independently tell researchers exactly what is inside a sealed chamber. To answer that question, the team eventually needs something much more direct: a physical sample, or a camera or person actually inside the chamber. Until that happens, the chamber's contents, its purpose, its age, and its potential value remain theories.